Today we will follow a patient, Mr. Gutbrain, through an extensive visit with his physician in an attempt to explore the role the gut microbiome plays in the development and treatment of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD.
Mr. Gutbrain finds himself at the doctor's office on this fine morning to speak with his physician about his persistent fidgeting, inattention, and trouble focusing at work. I might as well pass the time with some light reading. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, otherwise known as ADHD, is a debilitating neuropsychiatric disorder. ADHD is often characterized by persistent developmentally inappropriate levels of overactivity. The disorder is highly heterogeneous, meaning that it can manifest itself differently in people. This can make it difficult to diagnose. Common symptoms of ADHD include inattention, altered reward anticipation, and impulsiveness. Etiology. The exact pathophysiology of ADHD remains unknown, though it is thought to have a significant genetic and environmental component. In terms of environment, premature birth, increased levels of docosahexaenoic acid in natural development, and pesticide exposure during development have all been proposed as potential causes of ADHD. From a genetic perspective, ADHD is a polygenetic condition implicating genes involved in neuritogenesis and synaptogenesis. ADHD affects 1 in every 10 children in the USA. Wow, that's a lot! There are currently no biomedical tests for ADHD. Physicians must rely on the observation of certain behavioral symptoms to make a diagnosis. ADHD is often diagnosed in childhood and lasts into adulthood. Treatment. ADHD symptoms are often treated using a combination approach of both behavior therapy and medication. However, treatment is very subject-dependent. Wow, that was really interesting. Mr. Gutbrain to room 1.
What seems to be the problem today, Mr. Gutbrain?
Well, I'm having a tough time giving my undivided attention to anything. I can't focus on work for more than 5 minutes without pulling my phone out of my pocket, reorganizing my desk, or just staring off into space. I'm worried this issue is affecting my career and my close relationships. I wouldn't say that I'm bored with my daily life, but it seems like every minor distraction grabs my attention. What do you think could be the problem, Doc?
If my suspicion is correct, there's a good chance you have ADHD. I also noticed that you had trouble keeping eye contact while talking to me, and you haven't stopped fidgeting since you walked in here. If you don't mind, I'd like to take a closer look at your microbiome to find some of the characteristic differences associated with ADHD. Is that okay, Mr. Gutbrain?
Yeah, of course. Anything you need, Doc. I just have one question before we begin, though. What is the microbiome?
The gut microbiome is an ecosystem of both good and bad microorganisms that exists inside of your intestines. Let's take a closer look. From the time of birth, the gut microbiome is in constant development, influenced by both intrinsic and extrinsic factors. In order to understand this unique relationship between the host and the bacteria living inside, you must know that the intestines are responsible for the digestion of food. Much of the food that you consume contributes to the nutrition and upkeep of the microbiome. Aside from your diet, other factors like genetics, stress, antibiotics, and early life experiences influence the composition and health of your microbiome. Maintaining the health of the microbiome is crucial for the host because the relationship between the host and the microbiome is symbiotic. There are trillions of microorganisms in the gut, like fungi, bacteria, and even viruses. The bacteria in your gut influence the absorption and digestion of food, protection against bad bacteria, activation of the immune system, and the gut-brain axis. Microbial biodiversity is a key player in all of these downstream functions of the microbiome. Although there are many common microorganisms found in the gut of every human, the microbiome is entirely unique to the host. The previously mentioned intrinsic and extrinsic factors modulate this uniqueness from one person to the next. For example, an individual that consumes only whole foods and balanced dietary nutrients is likely to have a healthy gut microbiome, whereas an individual that eats mostly processed foods is likely to have an unhealthy gut microbiome. Although the microbiome composition is highly variable, families of microorganisms have been identified as common and essential to mostly everyone. The genus Bacteroides is a class of bacteria that is ubiquitous to the human race. These bacteria help us digest our food by breaking down polysaccharides as they pass through the intestines. Digestion is just one of many ways that the gut microbiome influences host physiology, indicating the importance of maintaining a healthy gut microbiome.
Now that we have that covered, let's examine the gut microbiome in relation to the brain. As you can see, the gut-brain axis is influenced by almost everything we do in our daily lives and in turn influences all aspects of homeostasis. The gut-brain axis is a set of constant bidirectional neuronal, endocrine, and immune signaling, facilitating communications between the gut microbiome and the brain. So what role do the bacteria in my gut have on the brain? That's a great question. A crucial link between the two organs is the vagus nerve. Approximately 80 to 90% of the fibers within this nerve are going towards the gut and brain. To put it simply, this link allows the bacteria in your gut to influence inflammatory signals, neurotransmitter and metabolite synthesis, and hormone signaling within the brain. Interestingly, 80% of serotonin and 50% of dopamine is produced by the bacteria in your gut. This is interesting to your case as the overproduction of dopamine is one theory of ADHD symptoms.
Wow, that's all very interesting, doctor. But what is the link between ADHD and the gut microbiome? Well, you see, while the gut-brain communication axis has long been established, increasing evidence is now suggesting that the gut microbiome plays a significant role in neuropsychiatric disorders such as ADHD. In the chart, we see the role of neuromodulators and the microbiome in neuropsychiatric disorders. We can see that the neuromodulators dopamine and serotonin play a key role in the functionality of the amygdala, hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex. This in turn impacts emotional regulation and executive function, which are areas that are deficient in patients with neuropsychiatric disorders. The arrows on the diagram indicate how well the connection has been established through research. Green arrows are convincing connections that have been supported through multiple areas of research. The green solid lines indicate a direct linkage, while the dotted lines indicate an indirect linkage. The red arrows show less established connections. Well, that is very interesting, doctor, but why is the link between ADHD and the gut microbiome a less established connection? Great question, Mr. Gutbrain. This is because while many studies involving both animals and humans have linked the gut microbiome with depression, anxiety, and autism, there is still a lack of studies being done to fully determine the connection with ADHD. This indicates a need for more studies that provide a comprehensive and in-depth analysis of the link between gut microbiome and ADHD. This is why my team has been working on a study investigating the overarching question, what role does the gut microbiome play in the development and treatment of ADHD? You could be the perfect candidate for our studies. Do you have any questions for me about my research? Well, doctor, based on the information you just presented, my first question for you is how does the gut microbiome influence neurotransmitter metabolism in ADHD? A study performed by Wan et al. In 2020 will help me answer your question. A case control study design was used consisting of 17 children aged 6 to 12 who have been diagnosed with ADHD and 17 children of the same age who were selected as the healthy control group. Fecal samples were collected from both groups and analyzed using shotgun metagenomic sequencing. The results showed that the ADHD group had a significant decrease in veillonelase compared to the healthy control group, while Enterococcus and Ordeobacter were significantly increased. Enterococcus is closely related to neurotransmitter release, which suggests that it could play a fundamental role in how the gut microbiome influences neurotransmitter metabolism in ADHD. The abnormal increase of Enterococcus can cause an excessive activation of tyrosine decarboxylase, which increases the decarboxylation of tyrosine and phenylalanine in the gastrointestinal tract, leading to decreased levels in the central nervous system. This can decrease the concentration of dopamine in the central nervous system. ADHD onset is related to this decreased level of dopamine in the central nervous system. Therefore, based on these results, the study speculates that the increase in Enterococcus may lower intracranial dopamine, contributing to the development in ADHD. Wan et al. Further supported these findings by performing a KEGG analysis to determine the gene functional annotations and abnormalities in metabolic pathways to confirm the role of the gut microbiota in the pathogenesis of ADHD. This figure can be very difficult to interpret, so I will provide you with a brief overview of what the analysis uncovered.
There were differences in the dopamine synaptic pathways between the ADHD and healthy control group. The gene encoding for PP1 catalytic subunits was drastically upregulated, which increases synaptic sodium ion flux. Dopamine receptors are transmembrane sodium chloride dependent transports, and this prolonged sodium-related signal transduction results in an excessive activation in dopamine. These metabolic pathway alterations can cause abnormal neurotransmitter transport and reduce their concentrations in the central nervous system, which can contribute to the onset of ADHD. Further research needs to be done, but this provides us with convincing evidence that the gut microbiome does in fact influence neurotransmitter metabolism in ADHD.
My second question for you today, doctor, is how does the composition of my gut microbiome influence my ADHD symptoms? That's a very insightful question. Although the link between the gut microbiome and ADHD is unclear, there have been several studies analyzing the differences in microbial species of patients with ADHD and those without. This is relevant to our conversation today as it potentially identifies mechanisms by which the species in your gut are influencing your ADHD symptoms. For example, various bacterial species have been associated with ADHD symptoms such as altered reward anticipation, inattention, neuroinflammation, and impulsivity. In order to study how the microbial species in your gut microbiome can potentially be influencing and or worsening your ADHD symptoms, we are going to need to collect a fecal matter sample. Are you willing to move forward with this procedure? Yes, for sure. We have received the results from the lab. The most notable difference between your microbiome and a control sample that was used was that you have a significantly increased levels of bifidobacteria. But what does this mean? Using 16S rRNA sequencing on your sample, our lab predicted bacterial gene functionality to encode cyclohexadenyl dehydratase, or CDT, a precursor of dopamine. The increase in bifidobacterium was associated with an increase in CDT and therefore an increase in dopamine. This is significant as the dopamine hypothesis indicates that the overproduction of this neurotransmitter is likely to be the cause of several ADHD symptoms such as inattention, reward processing, and hyperactivity. We will now run some additional tests to determine how the different composition of the gut microbiome may affect the brain in your case. We found there to be a decreased neuronal responses in the ventral striatum during reward anticipation, which is a hallmark of ADHD. This hypothesizes a mechanism by which the composition of the gut microbiome influences dopamine synthesis in ADHD symptoms. That's very interesting. What else did you find in my gut microbiome? That's a great question, and we will go through two other interesting findings in your composition analysis. Our lab also found that you had significantly decreased levels of Faecilibacterium, which a study done by Zhang et al. In 2018 hypothesized this could contribute to the neuroinflammatory phenotype present in individuals with ADHD. Another interesting finding we found in your gut microbiome composition analysis was that you had a significantly increased levels of Ruminococcaceae, and a study done by Zapinska-Tukov in 2020 hypothesized this could be associated with inattention symptoms. With further research, we can potentially identify specific bacterial species that could serve as targets for therapeutic treatment, aiming to reduce ADHD symptom severity. Awesome information. I am excited to learn more.
Is there any link between gut-altering treatments and the mitigation of ADHD symptoms? Yes, there are a couple treatments which are thought to help decrease ADHD severity, including fecal microbiota transplants and probiotic supplementation. Fecal microbiota transplants involve the transfer of feces from a healthy donor to a patient's GI tract. In an FMT procedure, the gastroenterologist prepares the transplant by taking the donor's stool sample and mixing with a saline solution. The fecal transplant is 100% liquid. Once the transplant is ready, the doctor will guide a flexible tube with a camera called an endoscope or colonoscopy through the anus into the colon, all the way to where the large intestine meets the small intestine. As the doctor withdraws the scope, the fecal transplant solution is sprayed into the walls of the colon. Research has shown that fecal transplants can restore healthy bacteria in the gut microbiome. In 2022, Hoy et al. Presented a case of a 22-year-old woman who received a fecal microbiota transplant to treat a C. diff infection. Coincidentally, the woman had severe ADHD. Following the transplant, the physicians noticed a significant decrease in the abundance of 9 bacterial species which are positively associated with ADHD from pre-FMT to post-FMT. The patient also observed a significant amelioration in her ADHD-associated symptoms. It is proposed that the modulation of the gut microbiome through the gain or removal of certain microbial species may increase the production of hormones and neurotransmitters involved in regulating behavior and cognition, particularly in those with ADHD. As for probiotic supplementation, Kumpersack et al. Hypothesized that probiotic supplementation of Lactobacillus rhamnosus bacteria would decrease symptoms of ADHD in children. This bacterium is thought to be involved in the modulation of immune pathways in the gut microbiota, which have downstream effects on ADHD. The research team tested this by conducting a trial in which 32 drug-naive children and teens aged 4 to 17 with diagnosis of ADHD received either a placebo treatment or Lactobacillus rhamnosus probiotic treatment for a period of 3 months. Prior to the start of the study, participants completed a quality of life self-report in which they noted how much they felt ADHD affected their lives. The same report was completed following the 3-month trial period. The research team observed a significant amelioration in the quality of life of those who received the probiotic supplementation treatment, while no significant improvement was seen in the control group. Therefore, the efficacy of gut-altering treatments such as FMT and probiotic supplementation on the mitigation of ADHD symptoms is very promising.
Thank you so much, Doctor. I really have learned a lot about the gut microbiome and its interconnection with ADHD. I had no idea that specific bacteria such as Bifidobacterium and Enterococcaceae are associated with increased dopamine production in ADHD symptoms, allowing for the identification of therapeutic targets for symptom management. I look forward to exploring the potential of a fecal microbiota transplant or probiotic supplementation to mitigate my ADHD symptoms. It's my pleasure. I'll see you at your appointment next week where we can get started on a personalized treatment plan.